Hello, folks. Welcome to Between Awesome and Disaster. This is your host, Will Carey. I appreciate you folks tuning in. I hope you are doing well, staying safe, taking care of those closest to you, making the healthy decisions for where we are in the world in 2020. I'm feeling pretty good today. Today was it's been a pretty good week, like work wise, and I've been pretty consistent with I've recurred over this year, have tried to regularly bike at least a couple times a day, and someday using the city bikes here in New York City. And sometimes it is a real slog, and I find myself really embarrassed at how hard it is to get up what feels like a hill I should be able to do. When I'm not using an e-bike, I go back and forth about whether if I want to eventually get my own e-bike. They are expensive, but they make biking a lot of fun. But I generally feel pretty good after I complete a turn on the bike, because and I'm not trying to be one of these like fitness guru types. All I'm trying to do is I want like my 2X shirts to fit a little bit better. And that's really it. All of my options are clothing. All of my fitness goals are clothing related. So that's where I'm at, because I feel very good and pretty confident with how I look. I just want to, I'm feeling pretty good about a lot of things, and want to be around to experience as much as I can. And I don't know if that's still like the California sun and positivity gleaming off of me, but but it's where I'm at right now, and I like it. And speaking of California, I know I talked extensively about my California trip recently, and how much I enjoyed it. We're going to talk to someone who is a part of that. My guest on the show today is my buddy comedian Ethan Stanislawski. Ethan, I knew from doing comedy in New York City, and the last time I saw him was probably a few years ago, right before he moved back to Los Angeles. And he's a native New Yorker, and I knew him towards kind of like the end of his time living in New York, where he kind of started to feel like he needed a change. And he's been out in LA for the last several years. He produces a great monthly show at the Good Night, which is a karaoke place in North Hollywood that I performed at and had an excellent time. And we get into a bit about, and this has come up a few times on the show, this, especially New York comedians have this real kind of like divide of New York comics and Los Angeles comics. And now that I've spent some time in Los Angeles and performed in Los Angeles, I definitely I sense a difference, but I feel like I want to. It's definitely a place I want to vibe with either coast, at least when it comes to performance. That's just kind of maybe a natural extension of who I am. I am not one of those like. I'm not a confrontational person in the least bit. I have a need to appease and like confrontation, like when I have to do it, even if I'm completely in the right, still fills me with there's like a nervous kind of like rush when it happens. So that's where I'm at on that. But this is a great comedy talk. I had not spoken to Ethan at length in a while, and this was really great to sit down and like connect again after seeing each other out in Los Angeles. So if you guys enjoy this and want to listen to other episodes, I have like, oh my God, we're coming up on like the 300th episode of this show in a few months. I hope I could get someone. Gotta get someone really. It's got to be a special episode. So let's get in. We'll get into it. But if you enjoyed this, you can of course check out awesomedisaster.com for everything related to me, everything related to the podcast. And is found there at awesomedisaster.com. And let's talk to my friend, comedian Ethan Stanislawski. Well, first off, I just want to say it was great to see you in Los Angeles recently. That was my first time ever performing or spending any time in Los Angeles after being a like New York centered comic for so many years. It was really fun, man. You run a great show.
Yeah, yeah. No, awesome. Yeah, no, that was it was great to have you on it. It was since we were in New York, I've been it was interesting. For years and years I was doing stand up. So everyone on that show I pretty much knew. I've known them through the scene. It's weird. I've noticed that
Mm-hmm.
like stand up is similar pretty much everywhere I performed, like any community of stand up, there's weirdly like a universal language of stand up and comedy that's like, oh, okay, this is the same bullshit we're dealing with. This is the same kind of conversations we have with each other, the same like, general awareness of what's going on. It's not really any different based on location. Obviously, there's differences in terms of what the industry is, but in terms of like the kind of conversations and way stand ups function with each other, it's pretty similar everywhere I've been. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've noticed and kind of what I love about stand up because I've been fortunate enough to perform in like different countries even, and as soon as I like walk into the place where the show is happening, I can just always pick out a group of comedians. Like it's such a universal kind of thing. I love that about comedy.
Yeah, I performed in Cape Town, South Africa, like 5 years ago, and I was like 10,000 miles away from home, and I had the exact same conversations I've had everywhere I've done stand up with the comedians. So it was kind of wonderful, like that. And the material is completely different. I could understand like a third of what they're saying, but it was like when they're on stage, but like still, it was like, oh, this is awesome. We have this language, and it's hard to describe, but it is. But once you're, I started in New York, and then for like a few months, then I was in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'd never lived anywhere. I'm from New York. I never lived anywhere as small as Bloomington before, even though it's a pretty big town by Indiana standards. But there's a big comedy scene there, and I was just like, oh, all these people have the same language too, so that's awesome.
That's super cool. I didn't know that you had performed in Cape Town. What was that show like?
Well, that was interesting. My dad was teaching there. My dad's a professor, and he was teaching at the University of Cape Town. So he's like, "Hey, Ethan, do you want to come out and like see South Africa and Cape Town?" And I'm like, "Yeah," but it was like, "Well, I'm there. I may as well do some shows." And so, through one person or another, I found a Facebook group. Every city,
Mm-hmm.
like there's a Facebook group for like I'm coming to Atlanta, I'm coming to Denver, and I found the one for Cape Town just through some comedy people I knew in LA, and I got in the group, and then we were just hanging out, drinking and stuff like that, and it was just like, oh, here's the kind of conversations we have. I got pretty in. I did like 4 or 5 shows there. Four of them were excellent. The biggest one I bombed at, but that will happen sometimes. But I had really great sets, and the comics loved me. I'm still in touch with a few of them, and it was really awesome.
That's super cool. I love that you got to do that. That's amazing. And that was also my experience. I had that recently in Argentina this year, but even when I was doing your show and I was talking to like some of the other comics just who knew I was in New York, they're like, "Oh, New York, that's so cool." Like I feel like New Yorkers, and maybe I'm speaking painting big broad strokes, so I'm not talking to you who's listening to this. Um dear my dear listeners, but I feel like New Yorkers always had this kind of attitude towards Los Angeles and Los Angeles comedians, which after having been there, I don't get because every person I met in California, like my entire time there, was like so nice.
Yeah, it's weird because I have the experience of that both as a person who was raised in New York and who moved to New York, and as someone who did stand up in New York and then moved to LA. I think, New York has this weird like defense mechanism about LA. I think there's like a weird feeling of threat about it in general. And like everywhere, I was wired as a child to believe LA is the worst. Like LA is the opposite of New York. LA is the antichrist of New York, that kind of thing.
Mm,
And not that, but it was just like. But then, I went out there for a trip in college. I had a friend from college who had transferred to USC, and we were just driving around LA, and I was like, this is pretty cool. This is a cool, like, there's diversity that you don't hear about. You hear about like one type of LA, and there's so many. It's like New York. There's like a billion different stories. There's different, like, every neighborhood has its own flavor, and every part of town has its own flavor. And so it was like, oh, this is really cool. And I just had never seen that as possible in as a New Yorker growing up there. And then when I started doing comedy, I think like what I've seen is the natural tendency progression of comedy is like you start whatever town you're in from, and then if you get, you feel like you want to do this for real, you go to New York. And then once you have success in New York, you move to LA and you do it for there. Like that's generally like the general pattern, but and so there's a
Hmm.
lot of sense that everyone in LA is careerist and manipulative and that kind of thing. And there's certainly that side of stand up and comedy in LA, but there's that side in New York too, like the people who are, whoever plays the game the best tends to get ahead. It's not a meritocracy. But there's all, there's a thriving, indie scene, the people who are coming up, a lot of them are, some of them are manipulative, but some of them are awesome. And but even like people who I came up with in LA, like when they have success, there's a lot of people I'm like, that is awesome. Congrats for you.
Hmm.
Like Chris Estrada just has that new show on Hulu, This Will, which is awesome. I came up with Chris. He was like a buddy of mine. We talk about like Joy Division and shit and music all the time. He's just a sweet, awesome guy, very funny. And it's like, oh, okay. It felt like he's one of my generation who's killed it, and I have nothing but great things to say about him. There's people who are getting shows where I'm like, oh fuck, that asshole got that show. But that's all comedy scenes. I feel like it's not unique to LA in a lot of ways. There's just so much more industry here that you sort of focus on the people getting successful more. So,
Hmm. And I'm willing to bet that happens in other fields as well. Like I imagine that there's
oh,
like if
100%.
you're if you were like a doctor, it'd be like, oh, they made chief resident. There's like that sort of social dynamic is always going to be at play. So let me ask you. So you grew up in New York. You're the son of a professor. What part of New York did you grow up in? Did you grow up in the city?
Yeah, I grew up in Manhattan. My dad's a professor at Columbia, so I grew up in like Morningside Heights, Upper West Side area, like in Manhattan. So really in the heart of the city. And so yeah, that was just I didn't realize how weird that was because I just grew up in that. And then I went to college in Chicago, and then it was a different experience, different vibe there, similar but very different in a lot of other ways. And so it really sort of opened
Hmm.
my eyes to how weird a lot of my New York experiences were. But it was just I grew as a city kid. I've always been a city kid. Grew up in the heart of the city, not and it really, like I said, just was like that's my normal. And then I got to college, and I'm like that is not most people's normal. But yeah, but that's kind of
Right,
yeah.
you're one of the few native New Yorkers that I've had on the show, and to grow up in in Manhattan specifically, like that's as New York as it can get. What did your dad teach?
He's a history professor. Actually, it's funny because if you remember my stand-up and you saw some of it there, I have a sort of he's a Jewish history professor, and as someone raised very Jewish, and who talks about a lot of my stand-up, I feel like, oh, I got a very warped perspective on stuff because of what my dad's take was. Because I went to Hebrew school until until my bar mitzvah. I used to go to synagogue almost every Saturday, but I'd go to
Hmm.
Hebrew school, and my dad would be like, hey, Ethan, what do you learn today? And I would tell him whatever I learned. And he's like, all right, that's wrong. And here's why that's wrong. And that was like my youth. And again, like not normal experience. Even by New York standards, that's not a normal experience. But like that just was
Hmm.
my normal growing up. But yeah.
That's wild because I feel like our generation is starting to have those moments now. Like, hey, you were taught a bunch of stuff in school that is not exactly correct, and you were not told about a whole bunch of things because of institutions and people who didn't want you to know it. But here's the real deal, and to have that early on, I almost kind of envy that sort of like, hey, here's how what the world's really like.
Yeah.
That's like a valuable resource.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like I actually have had to adjust at various points in my adult life to like the things I knew from an early age were wrong. Like people in my age group have like gradually gotten to learn that over time, and I so part of me has been like a little bit like impatient at times in my life where I'm like I remember there's points in college where people were like, I went to University of Chicago, which is a very good school, but people were brilliant, but also idiots in other ways and just assholes in other ways. And they're like, so a lot of people like came from like, oh, I'm around smart people, thank God. And then they realized, wait, smart people can be dicks too in their own way. And I was like, yeah, no
Mhm.
shit. Like, obviously that's like, I just grew up with that, but I had to learn that. And it's just, I started to think of other examples here and there, but just like things I've known my whole life have taken time for people to realize. And it's not that like, but there's shit I'm completely blind to too as a result. Like I don't like there's shit that's basic for other people that I never had to learn. So I have just everyone has their blind spots, no matter what background they come from. Mine are just sort of skewed based on I feel like most people's. Like growing up in New York, like for instance, in my world, I didn't know. I tell this a lot. I didn't know there was such a thing as a liberal white Protestant. I just did not know that's a thing that exists. I just
Mm-hmm.
assumed everyone who was a Protestant from the Midwest or South was a Bible thumping lunatic who wants to kill me. Like I just assumed that, and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't like. It wasn't until I got to college and I met
Right.
people like who are like, oh wait, you are like from Southern Illinois and you're an observant Christian, but you're also super left wing. And I'm like, what? That I did not know that existed, and that's like a big chunk of people. Like I did not, so it's something.
Mm-hmm.
Just shit I had to learn. I'm very much like, all my friends in college were not New Yorkers. They're all from like Kentucky or Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin or thing. I just hung out with people who were very different than me because I was just realizing how skewed my New York upbringing was from what the most people in the country, let alone the world, have.
Oh no, no, absolutely. And like to have that perspective on the world, I also feel like New Yorkers, like New York kids, are become mature a lot faster. Like you're an adult very early on, and you have like all of these new experiences. Whereas like I grew up in like very rural Maryland, and so it was I to had that typical college experience, like the first time, like where you're meeting maybe you meet Jewish people or you meet people from different religious backgrounds, and you start to see like it's important. I love it because you see people for people, and that's also why I'm fortunate to have the traveling that I've been able to do. Is you see people for people. Like people are not their necessarily people are not their government. It's kind of in a way it's kind of like freeing. Like we're all not too dissimilar. The same way like we have those experiences when we go into like a different comedy room for the first time is like, yeah, we're from different places, but same kind of general experiences and desires.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like trying to think of a way to phrase this. Like, I feel like, especially where like I was in a very Jewish neighborhood in New York. I was raised, in a Jewish school. Like most of the people I knew were Jewish. When I went to a public high school. It's the first time I had not been in a situation where it was like 80% Jews who I went to school with.
Hmm.
And then, but it was definitely like I was bullied a lot. I saw a lot of people who were shitty to me, and like, I had a lot of negative experience with people I was raised with, and as an adult, I've sort of processed, hey, just because, like, why do I have all this resentment of my religion? Why do I have all this resentment, like, of Judaism as the way I was raised with it? And I was talking to someone like a year ago, and he was from Baltimore Jew, and he was raised like in a similar sort of environment, and he put it in a really good way. He's like, if someone is being a piece of shit and they're just hurting me, they're hurting the world, they're just spreading all this negativity and awfulness in the universe, but they're also Jewish, why should I feel more sympathetic to them than I do to someone who is not my background but is not doing that? Like I've never understood that in my life. I've never understood why
Hmm.
like I should have solidarity with assholes who just happen to share this sort of weird same heritage as me, and as opposed to people who have completely different backgrounds than me, but I gel with a lot and feel like a very similar interest in me. Like I've never understood being part of a group that you don't self-select, I guess is the way to phrase it. But yeah,
Exactly. That old like tribalism thing is kind of
yeah.
antiquated. Let me ask you this: Do you you go to college in Chicago? What is a moment like you have when you get to the Midwest where you're like, oh, New York experience is not the typical experience?
Well, I think the moment it's the what that it's less that, it's more like when I there were things I'm like, oh, people are like humble here, and people like I would talk to my friends from the Midwest and be like, they don't have the same kind of like entitlement that a lot of New York people have. But what I
Hmm.
really think of is like when I went back to New York after college, and a lot of my friends from college from Chicago or the Midwest moved to New York, and I had this moment where they would point out things about New York that I always assumed was normal. They're like, that's crazy. And I was just like, what? That's just New York. But then I'd be like, wait a minute, I lived in another city. You're right. That is crazy. I just assumed that was normal. Like, I had a guy I used to run a show with in New York who also moved to Chicago when he was 18. He put it in a really sort of dark way, but one that resonated with me. It's like when you move from New York to Chicago when you're 18, it's a lot like when you're raised in an abusive household and then you go to your friend's place and you realize they're not hitting you for no reason, and then you come back
Hmm.
to your place and it's just like, wait, why I don't deserve to be hit that way? Like, what's going? Like, you have that perspective where you're like, oh, it doesn't have to be that way. But people who either come from a really shitty background and flock to New York, or people who have always been in New York or the New York area and don't know any different, there's a lot of sense of like, this is this is how it is. This is the best. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be this way. And I like you saw me at the end of my rope in New York, like with especially the era we were doing comedy together, where I was like processing it in a very not healthy way, where I was like, "Fuck this, I hate this, that
Right.
kind of thing." But now I'm older, and I'm just like, "Oh, this is where I've come from. I should appreciate the benefits it gave me. It's where I'm from. It's not my home really, but it's where I was raised, and I try to appreciate it for that. Like I've made peace with New York in a way where I would like every time even like the first few years I go back and I just have my like New York tension. And now I go back and I'm like, yeah, this is where I'm from. I know how to navigate it. Whatever. That's sort of where I'm like with it now. But yeah.
Uh-huh. No, that makes total sense. That's really healthy, and I relate to that because I, for the longest time, was like always kind of running from like my, I guess, identity as a Marylander, or like I wanted to be a New Yorker, and like that old New York the transplant idea is once you live in New York 10 years, then you're officially a New Yorker. But my wife is born and raised in Brooklyn, and she's told me repeatedly, "You'll never be a New Yorker." It's just how it works, and I'm just like, can you give me this because you love me? And she's like, no, I can't do it. I
Yeah.
love you still, but I can't do it. But I've come around to like uh to embracing that part of where I'm from. That's sort of like rural, because I'm from like essentially like a rural beach town, like where wealthy people from DC would like keep their summer homes, and it's basically just like older artsy women and rednecks is where what I
Hold up
grew up around.
1 second. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Sorry. I have some weird audio issues with my computer, so it was getting weird feedback, but I turned that app off. So I should probably just there's an app I just need to delete. Anyway, yeah, no, I well, sorry, what you were saying about the beach, the town you grew up in?
Where I grew up is essentially like rednecks and artsy, like women who like craft is kind
Yeah.
of the two main groups, and I grew up like around that. And what was really helpful for me, and I want to ask this about you, is I was fortunate enough to have a friend who harangued me to try out for the play, the school play, and get involved in theater, and then having that little window into art, and then also discovering punk rock, like helped open my mind to a world of possibilities. And I'm curious if there was something like that for you. Like, was comedy always a present uh, love or passion to you, or did that come later?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a really interesting path I went on with like how I express myself creatively or things like that. Because I was always like like I acted a lot as a child. Like I went to like classical concerts. I went to plays. Like I'd often be like at a weird off Broadway play at 10 where no one was under the age of 40 other than me in the audience and stuff like that. And that was just and my dad's a professor. He would take me to all these things, and I loved it. But it was never like but it was very much like what high art world, whatever that means, that kind of thing. And but I would always be
Hmm.
like, wasn't until I got to college where I discovered like punk rock and a lot of things with like indie music and things like that. And that like I always say like my freshman year of college was like 20% school, 80 years just listening and reading to weird bands I never heard of before, and like that was my life in
Hmm.
like for the early part of college. And that was not something that was in my world as a kid, like punk rock. Even though I was in New York, I never went to CBGB's before it closed. It was just not on my radar. And but that became my life, but still, like I was into theater. I graduated college wanting to be a theater critic. That's what I wanted to do, and I was like pursuing that. I was going to plays, writing, trying to be a journalist in those elements, but I was also writing music reviews
Hmm.
and punk, and I got paid more for like I wrote for some publications like Village Voice and things like that. I had that like in my back pocket. Um, and I sort of the journalism world was sort of like a mess. I wasn't, and then I sort of got frustrated with all that. But all that time, I was a comedy nerd. I would like find funny. I love the funny stories behind the scenes as much as the music itself in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
There's certain like situations where like, oh, that band is funny, and people hate them for them being funny, but I'm like, no, they're great. They don't give a shit. They just are having a good time, and that's what this is supposed to be about. Like the amount of people like
Yeah.
shit talk I've heard. Like I think a weird band for me. There's a ton of bands I think about this with, but like the one that sticks to my mind is like John Spencer Blues Explosion was a band I always loved. And there's people in like the
Hmm.
in punk rock and any community who hate their guts because they making a joke out of the whole thing. And I'm like, this is supposed to be ridiculous and stupid and over the top. And like, if you're taking yourself way too seriously about punk rock, like, then you're missing the point. But that upsets some people. Like, and it,
Hmm.
I don't know. It's something that always bugs me. And John Spencer also was the kid of a professor, so I think the idea that when I found that, I'm like, oh, that makes sense because like here's this thing that's like an art form and that some people treat as a sacred thing, but you're not special because you're doing this thing. Like that sensibility, I very much understand, and that's sort of one of his ethos points. But just like mashing all these different things up, so that's like that's like one example of like several where I'm like, oh, this is like your attitude about this is because you have a very narrow scope and you take this very seriously. And then when I found, so like when I started doing stand up was I was like at the end of my rope with journalism. I didn't know what I wanted to do after that, so I got applied to grad school and got in at Indiana University. And between me getting in and me going, I started doing open mics, and I was like, I think this is what I want to do. Like I got that whatever that stupid bug you get in your head is. That's like this makes sense to
Yeah.
me. And then
Hmm.
that's how it worked. And I was like, no, this is the thing. And like once I started doing stand up, I'm like, oh, this is like the perfect way for looking back. This is what I should have been always been doing. I was only like 23, 24 when I started doing it, but I was still like, oh, all my experiences when I look back, that makes sense that this is the path I would go. And then it's just been comedy, 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 more or less, not necessarily stand up, but like other like improv sketch and things like that, which I've done a
Yeah.
lot since. But it's just like this is the way I found it makes the most sense for me to express myself in whatever form. So it's this transition from like this high art world to this world where it's like much more populist, I guess, but also like still an art form. Like I don't believe in high art, low art in any form, but there's still like this idea of like people in the world I grew up with never really saw this as a thing to do. Like they understand theater and they understand like acting, and like, but they don't understand, going on a stage in front of five drunks and hoping that your thing works and that's the best you. That's like that's what the form is. Like they don't understand that that's like that. Why would anyone do that? And I guess that makes sense to me. And however my brain works.
No, totally. Because and even to, if we're going to do this, like maybe like higher lower comparison, like if like legitimate theater is for a lot of like critics or like, uh, New York art elitists or whatever you want to think about, um, that would be considered like the pinnacle of art. And I almost feel like stand up they would lump in with the same category as like old vaudeville sketches, like more like not even necessarily lowbrow because there's a million different ways to do comedy. You can do it. You can do like super intellectual stand up, or you could do like lowest common denominator. But I almost feel like the idea of just a bare stage with no set and one performer, uh, with a somewhat with very varying levels of scripted material is, I guess, viewed differently compared to like a musical or something like that,
Right, but it's also
or
like,
opera.
yeah, but that's a perfect example of opera because I was about to say like I thankfully had a very good arts education. I learned like the history. Opera was seen as the crassest form of art in like the 17th century. When it first emerged, it was like below what stand up is now, easily. It was seen as like this is just
Hmm.
shitty over emotional drama. Like this was like hundreds of years ago. Now we see it as like this pinnacle of high art, but it was not seen that way until like the last 100, 200 years. And there's stuff like that all around. Like all this these comic artists now are being accepted in the high art world in a way that even 30 years ago
Hmm.
was not possible. And um and like so it's really just like seeing what the definition of high art low art is so fluid, and I'm glad I figured that out at a very young age. And like really to me it was never, it's just the fact that these worlds don't mix is the problem. And like part of it is they don't mix and part of it is they don't want to mix, and that's really what frustrates me in that situation. And like And there is like an element of theater to stand up inherently. You're on a stage, you're talking to an audience, you have a backdrop, whatever ridiculous form of backdrop it is, but
Mm-hmm.
and you're interacting with audience. The number of like I'm quoting Stuart Lee, who's a stand up who did a very famous musical called Jerry Springer the Opera, which was like a
Yeah,
huge
I
smash
love
hit.
Stuart Lee.
Yeah, and so he had a line. He was talking on Maron's podcast where he was just basically like, the amount of conferences and panels and hundreds of thousands of dollars that are spent on theater trying to figure out how to get more interactive with the audience and like break the fourth wall more. That's crowd work. That's like the shittiest crowd work, is doing what theater practitioners spend like books and books of work on trying to figure out. It's just crowd work in our world. That's like nothing for us. Like that's like seen as like, oh, you can do crowd work, okay, or you can write your jokes, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, basically, that's just like a quiver in the stand-up's arsenal. Is when the
Yeah,
jokes don't when the written material isn't going over. Okay, let's spruce it up with where you're from. What do you do? Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
And so you're starting in Indiana, and when you were getting into stand up, like who was who was really interesting to you? Like you said Stuart Lee, but like when you were first getting into stand up, who were you looking like, "Oh, that's really funny and really cool."
Yeah, I was always much more in like the sort of raw or emotional comics. Like Bamford and Marin were very much like comics who were on my radar in a lot of ways. And I was a huge Chris
Uh-huh.
Gethard nerd and like Kinane, that kind of thing. And like there's certain levels of like, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it. There are people like who just like click with you. And Marin definitely with his like, oh, his weird like, I am warped by Judaism and I have this toxic energy in
Mhm.
me that I'm trying to expunge, but I'm not good at it more often than not. Like that was definitely that clicked with me at a very, even in my early 20s. But definitely, like, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase it. Like, there's definitely people. I always love the people who do something weird on stage. I tend to just do used to do more written sort of standard stuff. Not really good at crowd work, but I am like someone who like likes when I see someone do something weirder in that context. Like,
Mhm.
because I have this theater background, it's performance art. I love that, and I just feel like that's I people will look down on that. And there's like people who do it really shittily, and or just, but part of it's maybe they're just figuring it out. But like, I don't know. I like when people do like a weird thing or just do something I haven't seen before on stage.
Mhm.
But like, but I just sort of eventually like got into really after college when I was like didn't know what to do. I was like Google. The reason I did stand up was like I was becoming this comedy nerd, learning about comics I didn't know about growing up, and then all of a sudden was like, oh, these are the people who are killing it right now. Let me. What are their influences? And there's people like I who are very intellectual who I love, and there's people who are very basic that I love. It depends on which way they hit. And like I don't know. And like for me another one was Simon Pegg in like the Hot Fuzz movie, the Cornetto trilogy
Yep.
movies. Hot Fuzz, those were like
Uh-huh.
huge for me, and I think like just because he was clearly someone who was brilliant, and like had this education, but he was presenting it in this very satirical way, but also very silly. And I couldn't like the idea that you could present this like savage social critique, but do it silly was something like that. That's perfect. Like that's where I want to do. I want to make people laugh and like this giggle while showing them something that is ridiculous about and awful about society and process it that way. I don't know. That's something that makes sense for me in a lot of ways. That's just like that's the goal for me is that kind of sort of the way I think of it.
Oh yeah, I loved those movies. Like those were a revelation to me. And I think Simon Pegg is like I think did stand up for a number of years before he got into
Yeah.
acting and writing TV and movies. So I feel like he's got this same background. And something else about like the closeness of stand up in theater. Like when you start looking at Edinburgh Fringe style shows and more like those more storytelling shows that have like an arc like
Hmm.
Career Suicide by Gethard or Nanette, like these more kind of more like funny shows, but or I like to call them like uh, funny with a heart, kind of
Yeah.
almost compared to nightclub stand up, which I love as well, but it's a different animal. I think you really
Right.
start to kind of see those lines start to blur even more when you start seeing those like essentially theater pieces by one person.
Yeah, like the idea of a one person show is not a usual thing. I can't tell you the number of like one person shows I saw like growing up, even like on off Broadway or Broadway shows. There's tons of like one person that are funny and have jokes built into them, but are also very like so when the net came out and everyone is freaking out, like, is this stand up? What does stand up mean anymore? Do you have to tell jokes? I'm like, no, that's a one woman show by a very funny person. Like that's what that is. Like that's
Hmm.
not unprecedented. It's great, but it's not like that changes the format. There's still going to be all these different styles, but it's the same art form essentially. Just like I don't know the line. I've never been big like as I've sort of expressed. I've never been big on the line between one art form for another. If you're just doing something that's interesting and compelling in your performance or writing, like that's great. But I don't think we have to get
Hmm.
into the weeds of like is this stand up? What does stand up have to mean? It means different things to different people. And as long as you're entertained and entertaining people as a performer and being entertained as an audience, that's like, who cares what the definition is? That's like what critics care about. That's not what actual people care about.
100%. And something I'm learning more and more, and this is as I teach myself like the business side of show business about like like critical darlings and stuff like that's not like what really matters is like connecting. And I think about what art I love. Like I got posters behind this computer of stuff I have framed because it touched me so deeply. Um, like having that emotional connect, creating that, building that emotional bridge with someone, that is very powerful and very impactful. Like as an artist, and that's what I think to me the key has been, at least in what I've been trying to do the last few years, is trying to build that bridge with people, whether it be the podcast or stand up or storytelling or bands, um, like just kind of uh, like emotionally connect with people.
Yeah, and I mean, like, to be fair, I feel like I was shitting on critics a little too much. Like, there is a value to being like, hey, this art is contributing to society in this incredible way, or this art is actually not up to the standards we should be celebrating or hurting society. Like there is a value to being someone who's not in that art form saying, "Hey, here's what this value is," and like all
Hmm.
we have, we're both comics. We both like have music taste. Like we're both like, there's a billion bands that are like, "Oh, they suck. Like what the fuck are they about?" Like, but that's fun. Like what is this? What entertainment is like that kind of thing. But there's also like but that doesn't mean that there's not a place for something like that. The difference is like if you get caught up in what is an acceptable style versus like I've never been on like this style is good or this style is bad or this genre is good or this style is bad. It's like, do you suck or do you not suck? Like that's the way. Are you good or bad?
Sure.
Like at what you do?
Hmm.
Like that's and are you helping people get through shit or are you hurting people? Like that's sort of the way I or like some of the best most popular comics in the world are doing really cruel stuff that hurts people and endangers people. We don't I don't like that. I don't It's hard to evaluate if that's funny if it's hurting people, but at the same time
Hmm.
they have an audience. And like so it's this very weird thing where like, I don't want to be tell someone they can't criticize art, but at the same time I don't my more thing is like, is one style better than another? I don't really believe that.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you bring up there, and I do agree with you, um, about like what the acceptable style is. I know what I like to do, and I can appreciate when someone does something uh different different. I generally try to eat. And maybe when I was younger, I used to get a little more like uproarious about music. I didn't like. Now I'm of the point where it's like if you're making people happy and like you're keeping them out of like the militia meetings, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We need, and I want more of what
Yeah.
you're doing. And how long were you in New York doing stand up?
It seems like a long time. It was only really 3 years, and like that was like I started in the summer of 2010, and then I went to grad
Hmm.
school at Indiana University in Bloomington. But I was also performing at the Comedy Attic, which is a very celebrated club in Bloomington, Indiana.
Yeah.
It was really random that I had this incredible club that was built in this town, and that I would go to and try to get on stage as much as I can. And then I left grad school because I wanted to do comedy. So I went back to New York in like May 2011 and was there for 2 more years. It seems like so much longer than that, but it was just really like 2 years where that was fully my life.
Hmm.
But it seems like so much more. I started sometimes struggle to realize, oh, that was only 2 years where I was, was at it fully. But then I would still, because I still, when I went to LA, I was doing stand up consistently, the same grind, same way of pursuing it, and but then I started doing more sketch stuff. I was on a sketch team for 4 years here. That
Hmm.
we were really dedicated. That took up most of my creative energy. And when the pandemic hit, I was like, all right, I'm not performing Zoom shows. I don't really have interest in doing those. But let me at
Right.
least. I was writing a lot more scripts. I have a couple scripts now that are I'm trying to work on a little bit more. So it's just that kind of thing where it's like. Um, where it just was like it was so short when I was in New York doing that, but it seems like that was so impactful to me. That seems like a lot longer.
Yeah, because like when you're just like in New York, because I feel like New York is such like a concentrated experience. Like we spent like and because I moved there in 2000, moved here in 2010, and have been here ever since. I haven't left or moved lived anywhere else since. But it's such like a concentrated burst of like on the job training, and like you're just getting those like the stage muscles, and you're like constantly out and you're writing jokes in between sets on the train. Like it's just a pure like uncut hit of what you're trying to do. Um for that I think even shorter periods of time seem like a lot longer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't think I was good at all in my entire three 3 year span in New York. I was working hard and I was, getting respect for people, but I never like I don't do any pretty much no jokes. Well, there's like one or two jokes I did in those years that I still do.
Mhm.
Maybe depending on the room, but it's like and that maybe that's just things because the world changes, but it's also just like I don't know, it's just I was figuring it out and I feel like part of me was like, oh, if I stuck it out in New York, a lot of the New York comics I could have gotten more further with them, and like so, as part of me, they feel like I was just this messy idiot kid, drunk half the time on stage, trying to figure out what the fuck to do, which is like everyone's first 3 years or so of stand up. But that was all concentrated in New York. But people like I just see it that way. But people come up to me and they're like, "Oh, you were great. I miss you. Like you were really killing it there." And I did not see it that way. But I feel like I've gotten so much better as a comedian since then, just because I've worked with it and had more experience with it. But I don't know. Part of me feels like New York the New York world hasn't seen that to the extent I would like them to see it. But at the same time, just because of all my New York shit, when I go back to New York, I don't really look for sets. I just look to like see my family and the friends who I want to see and care about, and like
Mhm.
I just want it to be like going home as opposed to being like a performing opportunity, which is in part of me is like, should I do that? Is that responsible? Because it is New York for stand up. But I just feel like when I'm home for in New York for a week, I just want to be home. That's sort of how I feel about it a lot of the time.
Mhm. Well, my memory of you is I was you were always very chill. I always liked when I saw you, and I remember you always being very entertaining on stage. And but to your point, um, given the set I saw you do recently in Los Angeles, I think you've come really far. Like the joke about the bagpipe player and cops funerals, fucking hilarious. Is
Yeah.
really well written bit, and then like the banter you guys would have with your co-hosts, and then the sketch stuff you'd bring in. Um, it's really cool to see, man. Because and as we've alluded to before, I remember you. I think when you were like on your you're like I'm done with New York. I need to do some. I need to do something else. I need to be somewhere else. So I was wondering if you could kind of like take me through that time. Like when you were like, did you have a moment when you realized I got to get out of New York, and did you know you were going to go to LA?
I mean, it's a weird era because part of me was just like figuring a lot of things out in therapy about like the way I was raised and like a lot of this shit. Like I've talked about this in a lot of it, just like oh, a lot of my shit with New York was just like it's hostility and the kind of thing where it was like I don't need this. And I've learned later on, like I tried to watch Do the Right Thing again a few years ago, and I had to turn it off not because like it's a bad movie, it's a masterpiece, but just because there's
Yeah.
so much yelling in that, and I realized like oh, the way I'm just happen to be wired, I am very responsive to yelling. So if like people are being if people are yelling and being hostile to me, I don't like I can't handle that in the same way maybe other people can. And that's like if you
Hmm.
don't like yelling, New York is not the place for you pretty much. That's just that sounds like I'm a joke, but it's just a reality and it never was. Like there's just that kind of attitude was just never something that I was good for me in a lot of ways. And I was like, and it got to the point where I was just on the subway and I hated being on the subway. I'm like, I just want to be in a car in my own private space if I have to get to places. I don't
Hmm.
want to be in like this public sardine can anymore. I'm done. And I get like most of my frustration was getting to places. Not even like I got when I get to places, I was so hot already that I just had to be like, I came in like hot, and so I was like a mess when I got to places. I remember there's one time I forget her name, but I was going to a concert, not even doing anything for stand up, and the trains were delayed, and someone was being a jerk to me on the platform or something like that, and I was just like
Hmm.
ready to fully snap, and I was like going to scream on the subway, and then like a very very nice person in stand up like happened to be on that train who like not going anywhere. I was just like, oh, okay, she's too nice. I can't do that in front of her. I can't have my subway meltdown in front of her. She's a very nice person. That I just don't want her to see that. So, but like, so I was having those moments, and I was just like, I can't anymore. But I was like, I know I want to do stand up. Um, if I'm not going to be in New York, and I want to do stand up. It makes sense to go to L.A. So I had this like, I didn't have a license at that time. I took driving lessons. I learned how to get my license. I had a job lined up. Eventually, through random connections, I met a comedian in who was in LA but came to New York, and he helped me get a job in LA. And so, like
Hmm.
I planned for it for months and months and months, and then within a month in LA, I had a car, a place, and a job. Like that, I had all those things in my first month in LA because I had planned for it and knew what I was getting into.
Yeah.
So it really felt like it felt like a right fit. I clicked with LA very, very quickly. It really felt like a good fit. Definitely a different vibe, but that's still the same way. Like
Hmm.
still a big crazy city, but I was more prepared for like the big craziness of LA, obviously, because I've been in New York for so long. There's a funny moment actually where I like when I was like I knew I had to leave New York. I was like, do I go to Chicago because I know that city? I love that city. And I sort of was like, I know I probably have to go to LA anyway, but Chicago's a great city. I love it. What do I if do I do that? And then I had this moment where I was visiting, like spending a week there with some friends, going to shows, and being like, "Is this what I want to do?" And I went to this bar that I used to go to with some friends, and there was a guy there. It's like the ghost of future Ethan in the kind of way where he was
Uh-huh.
like, I was like, "Yeah, I'm debating whether to move back to Chicago or go to LA," and it's just like this 4-year-old guy who was like, "Yeah, I was creative in my 20s. I always wondered what would have happened if I moved to LA." And then he sort of stood and looked in the distance, and I'm like, all right, I can't turn into this guy, this guy. This guy
Right.
is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
telling me to go to LA in a weird way. But yeah, it was fun.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah, that what if ghost. I think about that sometimes, like
Yeah,
the me that never left Maryland. Like I just I shudder. Like I knew early on that's what I needed for my happiness, to get out of that state. So I relate to that moment really hard. So you're like, all right, I'm gonna do it. It's really interesting, that you bring up like the idea of the car being like your own kind of tranquil space, because I almost had like opposite the opposite reaction, because like when I drive, I'm like very on and aware, and especially like LA traffic. So I almost like being able to kind of turn my brain off when I'm on the bus or the subway, because it's like, oh, I don't have to drive this thing. Um,
right.
it's very interesting. Although I did, because we were staying in Santa Monica, so it was very helpful to be able to just like leave the hotel and get right on the 10 and get wherever I wanted,
Yeah,
basically. Um, but like very like hyper attentive, because I did not want to. I did not. Well, I didn't get liability insurance, so I was like, I don't want to get sued if I crash into
yeah,
something.
yeah. No, exactly. But it's also like, like I said, like my reality in New York, because I feel like most people who came to New York are like, oh, I don't have to fucking drive. I don't have to be on all the time, and like I could just be on the subway and just let not have to worry about that. But for me, it was just always like being on the subway is just what I was used to, and then it's like, okay, you're gonna see something stupid, you're gonna see something awful, you're gonna see something that makes you sad on the subway every single day of your life, and that's just what your life's gonna be. And the trains will be delayed in 5 different directions, and they'll be rerouted in 5 different directions in 10 places. Um, and it's just like this is not what I want to do. I want and like I want to be able to have the freedom to go where I want and not have to worry about like, am I going to see something horrible or be have surprise go to Brooklyn to go back to Manhattan or whatever kind of moments like that,
Mm-hmm.
or just I don't know. It's just never. It was just what I was. Both there's straight. Like anything, there's like positives and negatives to driving. There's positive and negatives to the subway. But for me, I was just so hyper focused on the negative, just because that's all I had known. And then when I got to drive my car, I'm like, I can listen to a podcast. I can listen to weird music that,
Mm-hmm.
and like just but not be like have someone fall asleep on me or have someone accidentally sit on someone or see two people yelling for no apparent reason at each other. Like
Uh-huh.
it was a tranquil space for me in a lot of ways.
Fascinating. I can totally see that. That's so funny. Like the two different sides of the coin here. It's wild. And so when you got to when you get to Los Angeles, like I'm curious how you approach stand up out there compared to New York, because I feel like I've heard people on, and I'll quote Billy Gardell, um, the stand up game in LA is more to like, you want to use it. It's a means to like get a role or to get a part, um, in something, compared to like you're feeding that into like like acting or writing more so than in New York.
Yeah, it depends. Like the world, I like a lot. Most of the comics you saw at that show were not that. They are comics, and they wanted to do comic. Like I always saw, like, oh, I'm doing sketch, I'm acting, I'm writing these things, and part of it is like, oh, it's so I'll have credit, so that when I'm a stand-up, I will get the kind of, I will be able to be known, and people will want to come and book me on things and stand up and pay me because they recognize my name from this, or I can say, hey, I wrote for this show, I acted in this thing, and then they can plug me in. And like I took improv classes both in New York and LA. And LA, it was a lot more like these are actors who want improv on their resume so they can say they've done improv, that kind of thing. But then I would talk to
Mm-hmm.
them and they'd be like, "Man, you have all this industry experience that I don't have." But they're like, "Dude, you have the ability to control your own destiny basically. You have the ability to write what you want to write and like you will get recognized for stand up more than like we are where we're just actors, period." Like, so
Mm-hmm.
there's on the one hand there is a sense that like, yeah, some people are doing it to advance there, but part of it's like that's why stand-up's great is because you have the option to do what you want to do and just be yourself on stage as opposed to like having to fit into these cookie cutter kind of things. I don't know. I feel like I just got burnt out with the grind of stand up in a lot of ways, and like I
Yeah.
love the craft of stand up, but just like the being at 10 mics a week, the waiting 2 hours for no one to see for no one to see you and not pay attention to you for your 3 minutes, and that's like what you have to do, like emailing 50 bookers a week or something like that. That's just it's not. I don't
Mm-hmm.
like that. And like if and like one of the things I've really tried to emphasize since things have opened up again, and like the shows I want to get on is like, and this is something like really up there to comedians have said to me is like, go where you're comfortable. I don't want to have to go to a room where I don't like the people there. I don't feel comfortable there, but I want to prove myself, so I have to go there. I want to go where I like people, I am liked, and like a part of the world I want to be in. Like that's really what it is. And if that changes, like there's places where I was very comfortable in LA and I go back down, I'm like, why did I ever think this was comfortable? This is just weird. This seems weird for me now, especially there were a couple of spots where I went to after the pandemic and it felt like I was recovering alcoholic going back to my old favorite bar. And I'm like, this just isn't me anymore, like in a lot of ways. But there's still
Mm-hmm.
people in that world where I'm like, oh, I love those people. Like Kevin and Joe, the producers of my show, are like friends of mine for years. I've always loved them. I always got along with them super well. And we producing a show at sort of our own space we know that like is not like dominated by people we have to prove ourselves to. Like we know that space. They love us there. We love them. And we can just sort of do whatever we want there. And that's like the dream, even though we're basically covering our expenses with what we're making. But we're not like earning a shit ton of money from the show, bar show by any means. But it is like this is where I'm comfortable. These are people I'm working with who I'm comfortable with. We're booking people who I like. We're in a space we like. And what else? Obviously we want to make more money, but other than that, like this is what you want to do. And hopefully, as that show takes off, more good things will come.
Oh, totally. And your show is great. Like that was like a delightful stand-up experience, like as both performer and then watching the show, because like I've heard so many like stories about like like waiting outside the comedy store like all day to like sign up for the open mic, or like I think lining up around at the Laugh Factory. Like I'm not sure like what the club situation is out there,
Yeah,
but like I'm in my like mid 30s now. I just don't know if I have it within me to go through that right now
yeah, and
anymore. So I'm in a way I'm performing with my friends, and again I'm making it work for me.
yeah.
The art thing now.
Yeah, and it's like I've done that. I've been on the lines for those shows, and there's certain things like I don't consider myself like an alt comic really. I like performing at the Comedy Store when I've had the few chances to perform there. It's fun. It's it's a different style, but it's a style that I like. I don't necessarily like the culture of the Comedy Store, and like a lot of people who are big there, I don't really either gross human beings or just people I don't feel like I need to prove myself to. But I love perform. It's just the environment for that works, and I know people who perform there who I love, and like you would wait at this open like what it was for it still is now is you would sign up for this open mic, like 150 people would sign up for 15 spots, and then you would just wait around for an hour until they post the list, and everyone rushes to the list to see if they got on. And I've gone on a few times, and people who run those rooms and respect me, so they would sometimes get me on a little more. But like like if in that hour you just go to Carney's, like this hot dog place across the street, just shoot the shit with comedians, and if you don't get on, you go to somewhere else, and that's cool. I kind of like that environment, but it is like it's an hour of your life that like may lead to nothing. But like I value when I did that, especially when I was starting, and I value that because it got me to know more and more people in the comedy scene in LA, and figure out where I wanted to be.
No, I that makes sense. I chalk that up to my experience of that was, that's all of these people that have talked to me on the show, like I knew from being in the trenches at Mike's and at
Yeah,
bar shows and all of uh these different places. Yeah, so I do see that inherent value to that. I guess it worked for me like when I was younger, and maybe now I'm getting cranky and tired in my
yeah.
old age, but
Yeah, no, I don't have the like. I wouldn't do that now. Really, it would be like if I went back to be like, oh wow, old school. I go back to the Comedy Store and do that. Wait, but it's like people I've met at the Comedy Store doing that grind. I will do their shows, or I will like hang out with them, just like go to a brunch with them or something like that and catch up. And like so it's really just it's cool. Like I like that. Like I did that. Like I'm in my 30s now. I don't really have the. Like, I'm just not capable of doing like 10 open mics a week and seeing what happens. Like I just don't have that in me. But if I keep performing with places I'm comfortable, keep doing what I'm doing, keep evolving my sets to whatever extent I can evolve them, do an open mic here and there, but not like kill myself to go to 50 of them a week or like whatever people like we were both in New York in like the 2010s and like early 2010s, and like Suba Agarwal, who's a great comedian, but she was like held up as like the gold standard because she go to like 30 open mics a week, and she would work a full time job and would just not sleep. And she's a great comedian. She's in LA now. We still hang out occasionally, and like she's it worked for her, but like that was seen as like the best thing you could do is work that hard, or work as hard as Suba did, and that's not like I just that was ridiculous to me even then, and now it's like that kind of work is just impossible for me.
yeah, I have nothing but love and respect for Suba. I could not work
Yeah,
as
she's
as hard
great.
as she did, but she is.
No,
I'm so happy that she is successful because she's a delightful
yeah,
person. Um,
yeah.
s-
But if she worked that hard and was terrible, she would still be celebrated. It's great that she's awesome. Like it's really great that she worked that hard and was also someone who was like very funny and very nice and great to hang out with. Like that's matters more than I feel like going to that number of mics a week, is that she has the skill and she's a hard worker like in her own way. Like I worked hard, but I don't like work like in everyone has their different work styles. So I don't know, but yeah. Point is, Suba's great.
yeah, exactly. And hard work with being funny and being pleasant to be around, all positive things in this industry. But yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with you. I love Suba. So last thing I wanted to talk to you about. So we were talking this about a little bit. You've been doing like you've had some like writing stuff you've been working on. What can you tell me about that? You have like an animation thing that you're working on right now.
Right.
right?
So this is a script. This is very much a pandemic. I'm losing my mind script I wrote. It's very 2020. It's called Antifa, Our Lord and Savior, which I wrote because it's basically about a trickster demon in hell named Antifa who wants to see how she can be. She's like a artist type. She wants to be a creative artist, and her form of art is trickster demonology. And then she eventually comes up to Earth and lands in the middle of a June 2020 Black Lives Matter police riot protest kind of situation. And she's like, what the fuck is this? And realizes that the most creative way to be a trickster demon is to go after evil people instead of innocent people, which is like no demon has. So that's basically the premise of the show is that she decides to go after evil people. And
Hmm.
her name happens to be Antifa, but it's also one of those things where I love this script. I've written a lot of things where I'm like, okay, this is cool and this is like fun, and but this feels like me. This feels like what I want to do. It's placed in a few competitions, and I was talking with some people about like, man, I can submit this. I can keep submitting this to places, but I'm hitting these brick walls. And someone I really respect was like, just make the damn thing. And I'm like, I can't draw. How do I animate it? Like I can't animate it. It's like, well, find someone who can draw and work with them. So I've been working with an artist on this and we've been working on some concept art and I found through a friend of my girlfriend's, I found this about this software where you can sort of it's meant for like visual novel video games, but you can almost like manipulate it to work it into like animating a pilot with some very basic coding. So I'm working with this artist now. He gave me like the character designs. We're working on a few expressions, and I'm going to be able to put together basically, hey, this is like two scenes from this script. What is it? And this is what it would look like in its own form. And so I'm working on that now, and it's just like, and I'm hoping to put it out there right now. Just like make my own art. Like that's what I'm doing. Like take control of your what you want to do, and don't wait for people to tell you you're great. And that's this script is ridiculous and it's like it's a joke a minute, joke a second kind of thing, and it's very violent and vulgar in a way I didn't know I could write that way. But it's very fun. I really love this script, and it's also the kind of thing you see that name on a pile of scripts, you're like, oh, what the hell is this? So that's sort
Hmm.
of one of the things with it. But so that's a script that's awesome. That I really not to toot my own horn, but that's a script I'm really passionate about, and I'm trying to really do stuff with. And if it gets my name to somewhere else, great. And I have my show that you were on, Avatar 2. Like I'm weirdly doing plugs, but it's also like I'm just basically my point is like I'm trying to do things on my own terms, and thankfully I have like a job where I earn on my own, so I don't have to necessarily like this is not my livelihood to do this, but I can do this until I get the kind of um, and get the kind of attention for the kind of work I do want to do. But I'm not like crushing my fingers like when is the gatekeeper going to find me? I'm just earning money on my own, doing what I want to do on my own terms, and hopefully good things will happen.
And I think that's the way to do it. It's certainly the way that's been working for me, and I look forward to seeing it work for you as well, my friend. So what else can we plug before we get out here? So you've got your monthly show at the Good Night in North LA. What else can we plug?
Yeah, so that show's called Avatar 2 at the Good Night. It's usually every third Saturday. Yeah, you can if you want to see that script, it's on Coverfly. So feel free to look up Ethan Stan Comedy on Twitter and Instagram. And I don't really post much on social media anymore because social media is a hellscape. But and also I have uh people in my life who I don't want to see my opinions on, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But anyway, I don't. But those are good things. I This is a longer conversation, but I'm sort of starting my own entertainment company. It's called Devera. That it's like using tech and entertainment in an interesting way, just based on like my years of like tech experience, like in customer support and like just software jobs. Trying to use some software for help out the entertainment industry in a way that's not really been used. More technical, but that's the thing I'm working on as well. So if you have any interest in how tech can benefit the entertainment industry, it's called Devera. At the website's devera.co if you want more information on that. And just connect with me. I'd love hearing from people who share a similar vibe. And yeah, let's do some cool shit.
Awesome. Ethan, pleasure as always to get to chat with you, man. And
Yeah,
this was
absolutely.
this was a true delight, and I look forward to the next time we see each other, my friend. So thanks again for doing the show.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Will, for having me.
It's always really cool to see friends of mine from the New York comedy scene that I haven't seen in a while not only continue on in comedy, but continue on in doing like cool things and really kind of like finding their place and really branching out. It's really awesome to see, and I think Ethan's gonna do great things. So thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, Ethan, for taking time to talk to me. And if you enjoyed this and want to listen to other episodes of this podcast or think you know a friend who would find this interesting, you can send them to awesomedisaster.com. That's got links to everything related to Will Carey as well as this show. We are on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. I'm also on Instagram at WillCarey23, and I'm on Twitter at ComicWillCarey. And if you guys want to go a little bit further in supporting the show, we have links to our merch store. Have a lot of really cool merch designs, not just pictures of the artwork, but as well as like different ideas I've had that I've collaborated with artists on, as well as our Patreon, which is patreon.com/awesomedisaster. I got a lot of exclusive videos and live streams that are only available to folks who subscribe to the Patreon. So thank you guys again so much for checking those out and for continuing to be excellent. And that is going to be my mode of operation for the foreseeable future. This fall's going to be fall and winter will be interesting. I have a lot of weddings on the calendar, weddings of very close friends that I'm excited to attend, and hopefully, and on the calendar is some international travel. So may the situation of the world and our slow but steady crawl out of the pandemic continue to hold, and I look forward to. I'm looking forward to things, and it feels good to feel that way. So, thank you guys again so much for being here. I hope you're doing well, and and thanks for including me in your podcast routine. And I will see you guys next time between awesome and disaster. Stay safe, wear a mask, get vaxxed, get boosted, and stomp out fascism. Take care, everybody.